says Kotler is a professor of history at Willamette University, where he teaches a range of courses on U.S. history. His first book, Tom Paine's America, The Rise and Fall of Transatlantic Radicalism in the Early Republic, I just love saying that, won the Best First Book Prize from the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic. Congratulations. A while ago, quite a while ago. He's currently working on an article entitled Rightlandia, Walter Huss and the Long History of the Far Right in Oregon, 1955 to 2005. Fascinating stuff about the anti-communist crusader with ties to white nationalists and neo-Nazis who was elected chair of the Oregon Republican Party in 1978.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to talk more generally today and then about the history of fascism, which is something that I think, judging from the ages of the folks in the room, roughly my age and maybe older, is not something I ever thought existed. When I was in graduate school in the 1990s, if someone ever told me that I'd be teaching a class on the history of fascism in America, I would have looked at them like, what? That's not a thing, is it? That's not a topic. And now all of a sudden we've sort of come to realize maybe that was a topic and we didn't realize it. So that's basically what I'm going to talk about. And I want to start with a history of fascism that was written in the year 2004. So this is not, Donald Trump was still donating to Democrats in 2004. And so this was not written about Donald Trump in the year 2004. But I think it's a really kind of frightening definition to read in 2026. So, and I will read it. So fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood. So that's the first part. Sort of obsessed with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood. And by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. Yeah, whoa, right. So that's a definition of fascism from 2004, written by Robert Paxton, who was a historian of Europe. And when Donald Trump was elected, people went to Robert Paxton. They said, "You're the leading historian of fascism. Do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?" And he said, "No, I don't think that really applies." This was in 2017, so on. And then after January 6th, people went back to Robert Paxton. At that point, he was in his kind of later 70s, I think. They said, "So what do you think now?" And he's like, "Yeah, you can use the word." So anyway, this is where we are today. And I have to say, the external expansion part didn't seem relevant in the first iteration. In Trump 1.0, it wasn't as relevant. But with what's been happening lately with Venezuela, the saber rattling with Canada, Greenland, what's happening in Iran, obviously, that piece of it has become even more kind of apparent. So anyway, so that's a joyful place to start. And I have to say, in 2004, when he wrote this, if someone had said like, "Hey, you're describing George W. Bush," most people would have said, "No, it's not. That doesn't really describe George W. Bush in 2004. And it really didn't. I mean, pieces of it, maybe. But obviously, the party of George W. Bush was the party that brought us Donald Trump. So Donald Trump, as Kamala Harris would say, didn't fall out of a coconut tree, right? This didn't come out of nowhere. Yeah. Great. Yes. So that would be, I mean, people talk about the cult-like dimensions of MAGA a little bit, and compensatory means that it's making up for what's lost. Right. So it's so Roger Griffin, who's another historian of fascism, he defines fascism as palingenetic ultranationalism. Palingenetic means rebirth, right? The sense that there once was a great nation, it has died or it has weakened, and it needs to be reborn, right? And so we will engage in this kind of purification of the nation to restore it to what it once was. So this is where the kind of white Christian nationalism comes in, right? And the anti-immigrant stuff, this idea that America in its heart, in its authenticity, is a white Christian nation that has moved away from what it was intended to be and has been, what was the line President Trump used? Something like the immigrants who are poisoning the blood of our country, right? So that kind of talk about the idea of the blood and soil kind of version of American national identity that has been sullied, right, by cultural change, it's a demographic change, et cetera. So I think that's what he has in mind there. All right. So, this is a very abbreviated history of American fascism for the last 100 years. Some of these terms may be familiar to you. Most historians of fascism, there's debate about whether the second Klan of the 1920s counts, but I think it does as a kind of originary moment for what would be a kind of modern American fascist tradition. And the American Legion as well of the 1920s. The leader of the American Legion looked at what was happening in Italy and said, that's awesome. And he actually invited Mussolini to be an honorary member of the American Legion in the 1920s. And he said the American Legion is to America what the fascisti are to Italy. Now, obviously, I mean, my grandfather was in the American Legion. So to just say the American Legion is a fascist organization would be an overstatement, right? But there were elements of that that have fascistic elements. In the 1930s, there was the German-American Bund. You've probably all seen the short film about the 1939 Madison Square Garden Nazi rally in February of 1939. The Silver Shirts, which was led by William Dudley Pelley, who called himself America's Hitler. There's a Silver Shirt organization here in Salem. They were big in Portland, the Silver Shirts. And the guy that I'm writing about, who became the chair of the Oregon Republican Party in 1978, I am 99% sure that I have identified him as a Silver Shirt from the 1930s. So that's a kind of direct personnel line. And then Father Coughlin, who was a radio preacher who was listened to by roughly, the estimates are rough, but some have predicted like 15 to 20 million weekly listeners to Father Coughlin, which for comparison point, Tucker Carlson at his height was reaching 4 million viewers in a nation that's 3 times the size, right? So Father Coughlin was incredibly influential in the 1930s. Okay. In the 1940s, there was Gerald L.K. Smith, who you may have heard of. He started with Huey Long in Louisiana. He was Huey Long's right-hand man, and then after Long was killed, Gerald L.K. Smith picked up the populist piece, but moved it kind of further right, and he was the founder of a party called the America First Party, a phrase that might be familiar to you, in 1944, and he also founded a thing called the Christian Nationalist Crusade in 1944. And Father Coughlin was, not Father Coughlin, Gerald L.K. Smith was an admirer of Hitler, and he was an anti-communist Christian, and to his mind, communism was a Jewish conspiracy, which might sound familiar to folks familiar with Nazism in the 1930s, which saw communism as a Jewish conspiracy. So that's Gerald L.K. Smith. He had a mailing list of about 3 million people in the 1950s and 1960s. His magazine, The Cross and the Flag, had a circulation that was 3 times the size of National Reviews in the 1960s. But almost nobody knows about him, is familiar with him. Again, the guy I'm writing about, Walter Huss, chair of the Oregon Republican Party, huge fan of Gerald L.K. Smith's and a subscriber to his magazine, The Cross and the Flag. In the 1950s, there's the National States Rights Party, which is an anti-civil rights party. They bombed a bunch of churches and synagogues and assassinated several civil rights leaders. One of Walter Huss's proteges was the Oregon head of the National States Rights Party in the 1960s. The John Birch Society in the 60s is they're actually maybe on the left edge of the fascist tradition in America. The John Birch Society maybe doesn't count. And in part because the John Birch Society, one of the things they did, is they kicked out anti-Semites. And a lot of people got mad about that because they were like, how can you fight communism if you're going to keep Jews in your organization, was the thinking, right? Because in their mind, communism was Jewish. So there was the Minutemen, there was the American Nazi Party, there's the Posse Comitatus movement, which is big out here in the West, right? Again, the guy I'm writing about, Walter Huss, one of the most amazing things I found in his archive was a letter in 1985 on the letterhead of the Posse Comitatus organization saying that Walter Huss was not a member of the Posse Comitatus movement. Very convincing. Anyway, and this was written by two people who were his friends for 25 years. So not super convincing. And in the 1980s and 90s, there's the militia movement, David Duke, Pat Buchanan, Timothy McVeigh, et cetera, right? So, and there's all kinds of genealogical sinews that connect these organizations and the people in them and the rhetoric that they used, et cetera, and so forth. So I think for the most part, folks didn't see America as having a meaningful fascist tradition because it was like, well, yeah, but these guys were losers, right? Like the John Birch Society, come on, they're a joke, right? So there was this sense that this stuff really wasn't significant or meaningful. But my argument is, and this is where the rhizomatic term comes in, is that kind of under the surface. So for example, on AM radio, one of the leading anti-Semitic organizations in the nation, the Liberty Lobby, which was run by a guy who had celebrations for Hitler's birthday in his office in DC. The Liberty Lobby had programs that aired on 500 AM radio stations in the United States in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, right? So as you're driving around, you could hear this stuff pumping out of your AM radio station all over the country. And most people would listen to it and they'd say, well, that's kooky stuff, right? Why does this matter? Why do we care about this? But people were listening. So this is a great book, A Liberal America by Stephen Hahn. And he uses the metaphor of thinking about fascism as a kind of pulse. This idea that there are these moments, and I think of it as a kind of like at a dance party where the music is pumping out and some people are hearing it and dancing to it, and other people are like, oh, that's terrible. That doesn't work for me. But these pulses are kind of going out, and some people are kind of picking up on it and really jiving with it. Right? And so these fascist cultures or movements, as they exist in history, they sometimes, and it hasn't happened yet in the US, they turn into a fascist regime, right? That's what happened in Italy. That's what happened in Germany. But fascist regimes don't just come out of nowhere, right? They emerge out of these fascist political movements and political cultures. And there have been many places around the world where fascist political cultures have existed, like in the US, for example, but where it just hasn't kind of been able to take power and take over control of the state. This is why, to my mind, the hammerlock that the Republican Party has on all three branches of government right now is a little terrifying, right? And the party still has within it plenty of folks who are not fully down with the full fascist project. But it has really, that vision of the world has really gained a significant foothold in that party. Okay. A historian named Joseph Franczak also has what I think is a really useful way of thinking about fascism. He calls it participatory anti-democracy. We're used to thinking of participatory democracy, right, as progressives. But I think why this is useful is we tend to think of these fascistic elements of American history as like part of the past. They're kind of dead. They're vestigial. They're kind of leftovers. Oh, well, that guy, he's just a bigot, right? And then eventually he's going to die and his bigotry will die with him, right? Is the usual thinking. But that's not the way that works, right? Bigotry has a way of reproducing itself, right? And bigotry provides the people who engage in it with a lot of pleasure that maybe doesn't make sense to us, which we can't fully understand and empathize with, but is meaningful to them, right? And I think if we don't understand fascism as being a creative force, a productive force, something that brings the people who participate in it some sort of pleasure, then we misapprehend what it is, right? I think we undersell its power. Okay. Talked about that already. So historically, one of the reasons why folks of our generation, I don't have to explain this to my students, or my students don't even get this. Like, I talk about Mark Hatfield to my students at Willamette, and they're like, what? He was a Republican? No, that can't be, right? And so we were I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think folks of my generation and older were socialized into a world where we understood there being conservatism. There were conservatives. And to call William F. Buckley a fascist was like, come on, that's like a little much, right? Like that's you're just name calling now, right? And so Cold War conservatism was this kind of fusion of libertarians and social conservatives, which is obviously a kind of volatile mixture, right? Because like libertarians and social conservatives don't always kind of agree as to what the state should be doing, but they found common cause around their opposition to communism during the Cold War, right? So this is the like Bill Buckley National Review version of the world that we're probably familiar with, right? Now, I want to say, even Buckley's conservatism was always more of what historian David Austin Walsh has called a right-wing popular front. In other words, there were a whole bunch of people in Buckley's coalition who were like pretty far out there. And as long as they kept it kind of muted, he was okay with keeping them inside the tent. So like, for example, with the John Birch Society, he did not purge the John Birch Society from the conservative movement. He said Robert Welsh has gone too far when he called Dwight Eisenhower a communist. Low bar, right? But the John Birch Society members, I'm sure they're all good people and they mean well, and they've just been deluded by their leader who's maybe saying some crazy things. And he needed to say that because like a good chunk of his subscribers to his struggling National Review were John Birch Society members, right? Also, his brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, who was the ghostwriter for Conscience of a Conservative, that classic by Barry Goldwater from 1960, right? So Brent Bozell was kind of late with some of the drafts for it because he was living in Franco's Spain because he thought Franco was awesome. So Francoism and American conservatism aren't entirely incompatible. Pat Buchanan, huge Francisco Franco fan, right? So there were plenty of American conservatives who kind of went over that line a little bit into what we might call fascism. And so conservatism itself, like most terms, like it's a moving target, right? So what was conservatism in the 1970s or 80s or 90s isn't exactly what it is today. And I think that's been the source of some confusion now, right? That a lot of folks who we might identify as like right-wing authoritarians define themselves as conservatives just because they're Republicans and they vote for what they call conservatism, right? So in the name of conservatism, a bunch of people stormed the US Capitol and smeared feces on the wall of the building, which I think by most definitions of conservative wouldn't really fit, right? With what a conservative should do. But they, and the Oregon Capitol, right? So this is what I mean by saying like, what we mean by conservative is like a kind of moving target. And one thing that far right has succeeded recently in is basically capturing that brand, which is a very popular brand. A lot of people identify as conservatives, and then they take the signals of what that means from the people who are leading in that group, right? Oh, it means that January 6th is okay, and I'm a conservative? Okay, cool. That's what it means to be a conservative, right? Okay. So the right has been quite successful in taking ownership over this term of conservative. I sometimes freak my students out by explaining why I'm a conservative, because I believe in Social Security and the right to organize labor unions, and I believe in civil rights. I believe in peaceful protest, and I'm like, wait, that doesn't make you a conservative. That makes you a liberal. I'm like, well, why? Those are like super old things that I think are good that I want to hold on to. Anyway. Okay, so both Cold War libertarianism and social conservatism, which were the two kind of threads that fed into conservatism, both of them had these authoritarian impulses, which I know is weird to think of libertarian authoritarians, but it's a thing. If you, like, for example, when Pinochet took over, a significant number of the people wielding guns were Americans who thought Milton Friedman was awesome. They were like, they came from the University of Chicago, and in the name of free market capitalism, they went down to join Pinochet in his murders of communists in Chile, right? So some libertarians, they see what they think of as a natural social order of racial, gender, or class hierarchy. Libertarians are often really into the idea that race and IQ are connected to each other. And this they use to justify the hierarchies that exist in society. And they explain, like, oh no, this isn't oppression. This is just nature, right? This is just the way the natural world is, or the way they understand the sort of traditional roles of men and women. But this is a feature of nature. It's not a political choice, right? This is not. So some social conservatives, like the paleo conservatives, like someone like Pat Buchanan from the 90s, they were generally far more comfortable with the use of state power to impose their vision of a properly ordered society. We're seeing this with abortion laws, right, in red states. But for the most part, in the 80s and 90s, this was kind of irrelevant because the idea that like social conservatives could ever gain control of the state and use the state to impose their vision on the country seemed like outlandish, right? And there were still people in charge of the Republican Party, like someone like Jim Baker, right, or Mark Hatfield, or some of these other more moderate Republicans who were like, what do you mean? You can't, America's not a Christian nation. Like, we're a nation that believes in separation of church and state. You can't like impose Christianity on the nation. That's nuts, right? But now, Pete Hegseth, Mike Johnson, a lot of these folks, and the idea that America, the church and state is a myth, or separation of church and state is a myth, is a common talking point. Right. Okay. Right. Also, just briefly, conspiracism. To my mind, the conspiracy theories, like, they're funny to laugh at. They're fun to like make fun of, like how ridiculous some of the stuff folks believe, like that Hugo Chavez stole the 2020 election or whatever, or the COVID conspiracies and so on. But I think conspiracism is really a central part of the contemporary right. And this is why I don't have time to fully develop this argument, but conspiratorial anti-communism, the idea that there is a vast secret conspiracy that controls, the nation's media, the entertainment system, the schools, the government, right? The communists are brainwashing the children with Beatles music or whatever it might be, right? That's often hard to disentangle from the more sort of anti-Semitic and fascistic anti-communist conspiracy theory, which is that communism was a Jewish conspiracy, right? Like when people talk about who controls the media and who controls Hollywood, right? And oftentimes that is a kind of coded form of anti-Semitism. And so this is why a lot of pro-democracy anti-fascist groups in the Cold War era, like the ADL, which used to do that, they've sort of ceased doing that mission very well. But they would closely monitor anti-Semitism on the right for precisely this reason, because it was a really bright line, right? If you were a conservative anti-communist who was an anti-Semite, that's pretty much Hitler territory, right? Like that's pretty much, you've entered into Nazi territory. And so drawing that distinction between someone who opposes communism, like reasonable reasons, for healthy reasons, versus someone who opposes communism because you think the Jews are behind it. And we know if you have identified what ethnic group was responsible for the communism, the solution to that problem becomes genocide, right? And so this is why that element of the far right was something that the groups monitored closely. At this point, the anti-Semitism is just rampant, right? I mean, with Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson, and it's just kind of everywhere on the right now. It's just completely metastasized. There's sort of no getting it back in the bottle. Okay, so the last thing I want to end on is, so I handed out this sheet. I'm not going to read through all of this, but basically what I'm going to do is like, this is, I think, a useful way to think about the American political spectrum in the Cold War era, right? So this is like the far left, like this is the Communist Party of the United States. And there's like, by the time you get to the 60s and 70s, there's like 30,000 people here, right? Like this is like an incredibly tiny number of people who would be in this box. But of course, the nation spends a ton of time talking about the threat that this supposed, all these communists pose, right, to America. Yeah. And then there's this big kind of mushy middle, right, that extends from the kind of progressive left to the kind of conservative right, where there's a rough consensus around the idea that America is a multiracial democracy with it values religious pluralism and cultural pluralism, right? That's what America is. We're a land of immigrants. that values the diversity of the country. And that is something that Bill Buckley could assent to. And it's something that, Michael Harrington could assent to, or, folks on the kind of much further left. And they could agree on that just basic set of assumptions. And, perhaps over here, there were again, the Trotskyites who, had a different idea of what America should be and how we should get there. And over here, you had the American Nazi Party and all the people that I had on that list on an earlier slide. And for the most part, folks didn't pay all that much attention to this red line, right? There wasn't a whole lot of policing of this red line. So this, and I think one way to think about this in terms of parties is that until the 1960s, so the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were sort of both circles that overlapped here. And then over time, as polarization happened, they kind of split apart. And the Republican Party came to be a circle that included many more of these folks kind of on the further right, right? And so the coalition has kind of drifted rightward. This is another way to kind of visualize that. So asymmetric polarization, which is a term you may have heard, right? So one thing that I always try to, whenever someone talks about polarization in a kind of both sides kind of way, I try to emphasize that yes, polarization has happened. The country's become very polarized, but it's not symmetrical, right? And so this is a kind of graphical depiction of this from the New York Times. No, this is from Pew, I believe. And so as you can see, the Democrats have moved slightly leftward over time from the early 70s into the 2020s. And the Republicans have moved much further to the right over that same period of time. And so in other words, if we map that onto what had come previously, the Republican Party, basically the center of the Republican Party went from here, and as time progresses, it moved ever further and further that way. Right? Yeah.
You define here. I'm sorry, canvas lines.
Yes.
So
to the right, yes.
Yeah.
So towards the illiberal side,
Yeah.
towards the kind of fascist side.
So
Yeah.
that's conservative liberalism toward authoritarianism.
Toward authoritarianism.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes, I will. And so to map this onto other parties around the world in similar sort of comparable countries, the Democratic Party looks a lot like kind of center left parties in Britain, Germany, France, right up Canada, et cetera. The Republican Party started kind of over here, more like your normal kind of center right party in a European or Canadian context. And over time has moved until at this point, and this was done in 2020 or 2021. I mean, this is the AfD in Germany. At this point, I would say there's not a whole lot of daylight between the current Republican Party and the AfD in Germany, which is the party that genealogically descends from the Nazis, right? Or the National Front in France, or Giorgia Meloni's party in Italy, right, which descends from Mussolini's party. So that what we have is a Republican Party that in the 1980s and 90s was much closer to the center, has drifted ever further to the right. And so I think in terms of when we talk with folks who are independents or don't pay that much attention to politics, and maybe they remember their grandfather's Republican Party, and if you say the Republican Party is a fascist party, an authoritarian party, they'll sort of look at you like, oh, come on, that's ridiculous, right? That's not true, because they're remembering a party for which that wasn't really true. That wasn't really entirely accurate. But I also want to say that the seeds of this, the elements of this version of American rightism, it didn't just show up with Donald Trump, right? It didn't just fall out of a coconut tree and Donald Trump showed up. The party was kind of ready for this after years and years of this kind of building far-right movement on the right edge of the Republican coalition. Okay, so I will stop there and happy to take questions and hear what's in it. I can share it with the group, and yes, happy to do that. Thank you. Yeah. This I'll have to get the exact sources for this. I believe this is the Pew Center, and I believe this was in the New York Times. That graphic. I mean, obviously, these things are super complicated, right? Whenever you take political ideologies and try to map them onto a single line, it collapses a lot of important distinctions. But I think, but the people who did this are like serious academics, right? This isn't just someone trying to do something to score a point. These are folks who kind of do this work systematically. Great question. Yeah. Right. And there's a reciprocal relationship, right? I mean, parties both reflect their voters, but they also influence and shape their voters. And so just in the context of Oregon, let's just say, part of what I've learned from my history of studying the Republican Party in Oregon is that the party of Mark Hatfield and Tom McCall and Vic Atiyeh, very different from the party of the Republican Party today, was basically a hostile takeover by a grassroots insurgency led by Christian nationalists and white nationalists, like the guy I'm writing about. And this group basically forced their way into the party, and the kind of country club Republicans didn't really know what hit them. They weren't really prepared to kind of deal with it. And part of the change that also really matters is that parties internally have become heavily democratized since the 70s. Like, parties used to be the kind of backroom, guys smoking cigars, deciding who's going to run. And now with the primary system that was established in the 70s, basically, parties are now incredibly weak in terms of their ability to gatekeep. So this is what happened with Donald Trump in 2016. Every establishment Republican, the National Review published an entire edition in January of 2016 entitled Against Trump that included essays by 26 of the leading conservatives in America, all of whom said, do not vote for Donald Trump. He is not a conservative. You may not vote for him. This is horrible. This is a mistake. Lindsey Graham in March of 2016 famously tweeted out, if we nominate Donald Trump, we will get destroyed and we will deserve it. Lindsey Graham has kind of changed his tune now. But anyway, so what's happened is that the parties themselves just don't have the mechanisms internally to do that kind of gatekeeping. And so what it's led to is these kind of populist insurgencies amongst a fairly small activist base. Like in Oregon, the Republican activist base is very active, super radical. And what that means is that they end up nominating people like Jo Rae Perkins who don't stand a chance of winning in a general election. Right. And so it's created this really kind of bad dynamic for the party itself, and also just in general for democracy. So we're living in a time of weak parties, but really strong partisanship. Like, people really do identify as Republicans and they really do identify as Democrats, but those two institutions just don't have that much power, right, to kind of shape what they do. Anyway, yeah, Chip.
Just brought up populism. Can you expand on that for a few minutes to explore it?
Yes. So populism, and actually, it was a question about populism. And I did have another slide, but so thank you for that. That's not a plant. No, that is not a plant. So, and populism is a complicated political tradition because it kind of spans left and right. So Bernie Sanders is a populist. He is very different from Donald Trump, needless to say, right? So populism in America, there's a left-wing populist tradition and a right-wing populist tradition. And they're sometimes easy to mistake for each other, and they overlap, especially in the cultural realm. So this is where, like, the Maha stuff. I have several friends from college. I went to a Ivy League college. These are like generally liberal people who really loved Robert F. Kennedy. And I was like, what are you doing? But through wellness stuff and a kind of a skepticism about whether they be elites in the medical profession and the health profession or in finance or in other places, there's a kind of healthy version of that skepticism and populism, but it can very quickly get glommed onto by kind of effective right-wing propagandists who can take that energy, take those feelings, and direct them in much less politically productive directions. So right-wing populism, I think a useful way to think about it, what's really a distinctive element of it, is the way that it defines the real Americans I don't know if you remember at the RNC in the summer of 2024, the Republican National Convention, Hulk Hogan was the guy that introduced Donald Trump. Do you remember that? And in his speech, he used the phrase real Americans, like in every sentence, every single sentence. The real Americans are the real Americans do this, right? Thank God, the real Americans. And the real Americans are understood as implicitly as being the kind of hardworking white Americans, the normal Americans, and who are being attacked and beset upon by two classes of parasites, the elite parasites above them, like George Soros, who is this magical person who apparently does everything bad in America, but also college professors, other like Tony Fauci, government bureaucrats, other people like that, right? And Hollywood elites. And those elite parasites who hate you and aren't like you and are different from you and want to destroy you are working in leagues with parasites below you, like immigrants, like people on welfare, like LGBTQ people, like other folks who are perceived to be lesser than you, right? And who are sponging off of you, right? And taking money from you. And that it's a conspiracy between these people at the bottom and those people at the top. And what they're trying to do is to get you, the normal, real Americans, to hate yourself and to identify with those people below you and to feel empathy for them and to want to help them. And that's really dangerous, right? Because they're teaching you to hate yourself. Don't hate yourself. Be proud of yourself as one of the real Americans, right? That's the appeal of the right-wing populist, right? And so it has the kind of feeling of a democratic energy, right? Because it's railing against powerful elites, at least on the surface of it. But what it's doing is it's just replicating all the various kind of structures of power that have historically existed in the US.
Fair to say that other federal
Absolutely. Yeah, the scapegoating. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's what's going on with the attack on trans people, right? Or the current attacks on Muslim people. All the Sharia law stuff that's now huge. Like Muslims are 1% of the population. The idea that Muslims are going to impose their religious beliefs on the nation is just ludicrous. And of course, this is being said by the people who want to impose their religious views on the nation, right? Who are themselves also a minority. Like they do not speak for the majority of Americans. Right. But they want to impose their vision of religion upon the nation. It's always projection. Yeah. Yes.
And I'm wondering, because my perception, they all want the right taking that nebulous center.
Oh, interesting.
Over, not
Again, so this is where this collapses a lot of different issues together. So I don't know what metrics they're using exactly. I mean, remember in 2012, Barack Obama did not support gay marriage publicly, right? The rank and file of the Democratic Party did, but he did not say that, right? When he was running for office. So, I guess it depends on what kind of issues you're talking about. I mean, Joe Biden, in terms of how he governed, like some people compared him to like, that his agenda was one of the most progressive Democratic agendas since LBJ, right? Even though he wasn't very good at selling it and explaining it and so on. And what this describes is a movement very gradually to the left, not at all really significant. So, Zoran Mamdani would be like way out here, right? And some people would say that like perhaps Zoran Mamdani's version of progressivism is where the Democratic Party should be headed, or someone like AOC, right? And that's very much a possibility. But at this point, I don't think you could say that the mainstream of the Democratic Party is there yet, but they're in the coalition. So yeah, in the back.
You haven't mentioned anything about corporations. You
Yeah.
haven't mentioned anything about money and the ability of corporate to control mass media from the next right to 50.
Yeah, no, that's a huge part of it. And I mean, I would say at this point, the role of mass media at this point has been sort of taken over less by corporations and more by the far right, right? And what media is today is so different than it was 15 years ago, right? In terms of what people watch and so on. But no, absolutely. I mean, the corporate leaders were the folks who funded the business plot in 1934, the attempt to overthrow FDR. The fascist coup that failed to overthrow FDR was organized by, George Bush's grandfather and by the head of Bank of America, right, and so on. So far right corporations have long cooperated very much, right, with these kind of far right groups, and as we saw inauguration with Bezos and Zuckerberg and whatever standing there right behind Donald Trump, that alliance. I mean, I think to a lot of sense we can think of our current moment as basically oligarchic domination, right, that has consolidated around the right, and I don't think the Democratic Party has yet figured out how to counter that. In part because they rely upon the same economic classes to support their efforts, right, to get elected. Yeah. Right. Yeah, this is a question about Ernst Fraenkel and the idea of the dual state, which is incredibly important and useful. If you don't know about it, to look it up and read about it. So Ernst Fraenkel was a German legal scholar in the Nazi era, and part of his insight was that for a lot of Germans living under Nazism, they experienced life as normal. It felt like the Constitution and the legal system was still operating and functioning normally. And for them, it was. But for other people, it absolutely was not. So there were kind of two tiers of law. And part of the way that kind of the oppressiveness of the Nazi regime was able to kind of normalize itself into the culture was because it still continued to preserve a sense of normality amongst folks who weren't impacted by it. And so I think that's very useful in terms of thinking about the treatment of immigrants today, the treatment of students who are here on a visa for whom apparently free speech no longer applies, right? Or right to due process, and so on. So yes, it's a terrifying precedent, right, to think about. Yeah.
Wait, yeah. Okay, last question from the person on chat, just because we're out of time. I'm so sorry.
They're asking for you to repeat the question, before we end up. How much credit do you give the Fox News to expediting Republican news to far right?
Yes, I think that was historically very significant.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is how influential was Fox News in facilitating this move of the Republican Party to the right? So Fox News was founded by Roger Ailes in the 1990s with pretty much the self-conscious intent to prevent what happened to Richard Nixon ever happening again. That was part of his intent, and it turns out it worked quite well for Donald Trump. And so Fox News has been very instrumental in kind of building a kind of cult of personality around Donald Trump, and so on. I guess one question I would have at this point, I don't know how influential Fox News is outside of the relatively small community of people who listen to it. It's very influential with Donald Trump. He clearly learns a lot from Fox News and makes a lot of his decisions based on what he hears from Fox News. I don't know how culturally significant Fox News is anymore. But...
No, sorry.
Okay.
I was
Thank
a teacher
you.
too.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much.
So, yes, thank you so much.
I'll hang out.
Yeah, that would be great. We're going to take a really quick break. I'm going to get the technology hooked back up. And then, we may just need to have Seth come back and talk with us again. And that's how we solve world hunger. Sorry, Zoom people. I had the audio muted, and then I thought Lori was trying to tell me to speak louder, so I've been screaming at everybody in the audience. So what I was saying is, I was talking about, okay, so you missed, I guess, maybe all the stuff for the Vigil for the Dead and Disappeared, which happens March 16th, 2026 from 6 to 8 p.m. And then that will be at the state capitol on the splash pad side. Lots of faith groups have gotten behind it. We expect a large crowd. We have, we will have an ofrenda, and you're welcome to bring offerings to the ofrenda, which is sort of like the Dia de los Muertos altars that you see. Bring flowers, wear mourning clothing. We'll have a candlelight procession around the Capitol at the end of it, or around somewhere. I don't know. They have the route figured out. And then I moved on to No Kings 3. So No Kings 3, March 28th from noon to 3 p.m. We are on the website. That has been an issue in the past because lots of people are trying to get approved and they have to approve us. So it took a little while, but we have been on Mobilize for months. We are inviting all other groups to come and table or tent. We're not the bosses of it. We can't get liability insurance, so we've never been able to get a permit for any of these big events that have happened. We have tried, believe me, we have tried. And if you have a lead on liability insurance for us, please let us know. We will follow up on it for sure. But we're just inviting all the progressive groups. Peter Burgell will be there with Progressive Salem and Stop Nuclear Work Group, or maybe not. But maybe Progressive Salem will be there. You know, lots of groups come out. And so if you're involved, if you have maybe you're a member of a faith group or a church and you'd like to come out, or, you know, whatever, just come on out, set up a canopy. We're going to be on the north side of the center, we believe, where there's more concrete over on that area. So that's probably where most of the canopies will be. I was going to have Kathy do a quick treasurer's report, but I'll move that after. If Greg, would you mind standing up and talking about the peace team and encouraging people to join us? And then Kathy, if you could get ready for a treasurer's report.
Hi, guys. Peace team has been really working hard to try and get ready for these events. And we're now encouraging people who are working peace team to come out at 4:30 prior to the event on the 16th. And that gives us an hour and a half. What we're doing is we're integrating with the PCUN, the Migrant Farm Labor Union team. They have a similar team. I don't know what they call it, but it's similar to the peace team. And mainly it's composed of human rights observers, and de-escalators and monitors. And monitors are our eyes on the ground. You don't need special training for that, but you have to know how to use the radio. And at least our teams are 2 monitors working together. One person uses a radio, the other one's, you know, feeding them more information if they can, keeping an eye on the situation. And they report back to headquarters, and we send human rights observers and de-escalators to any place where there's trouble. We don't want people without training getting in there and trying to de-escalate or trying to stop a fight. The other thing is on No King's Day, we want our team out an hour early because we're working in zones. Some people haven't been coming to the rehearsals. We're going to have a rehearsal this Saturday, starting at noon, and we'll walk the vigil route, or we'll show you the vigil route. We're probably going to walk our regular route for our marches. We're not having a march on the 28th. We're not having a march.
We're not planning a march.
But we're going to be ready. If people start marching, we're going to be ready. So that's why we do that. We're going to be walking a regular march route, and then we're going to try and keep that the people, if there's a spontaneous march, keep them within the boundaries if we can. We encourage anybody that's interested in working with us, come on out. Even and if you can't do any training at all, even not doing the rehearsal, which is the last rehearsal was this Saturday. Come anyway, come an hour early, and that way we can give you a little bit of information. And we'll pair you with somebody who has had the radio training if we have enough people. So thanks a lot, and we're gonna take this regime down.
Okay, Kathy's going to give us a quick update on where we are with money. We always need more money. The more big events there are, the more money we need. So we appreciate any donations that people can give us.
So right now, we have about 4,000, a little over 4,000, which is less than we had at the last meeting. The good news is that we're buying things because this group is growing. We're gonna have more booths at our rallies. We're better prepared, more supplies. So that's a positive thing. So donations are always welcome. We're gonna have No Kings 3 t-shirts at the rally, so make sure you get one of those. We'll have new buttons. I'm pretty sure we'll have some new button designs maybe. And I look forward to seeing you at the vigil and especially at No Kings 3.
So currently, we're doing okay financially. We have enough money to cover the meeting, cost for the meeting room here monthly and those kinds of things. But like Kathy says, whenever there's a big, and if you'd like to pass the hat, if anybody has a hat they'd like to pass, Tom, perhaps. We take all types of donations. That's if you get a permit. So Melinda's question was about the permitting process with the city for using the splash pad. The people who get permits are charged $1 per person. So if we had 10,000 people, which we hope we'll have 10 or more, 15,000 people for No Kings, we don't have that kind of money. So yeah. So it's not, we're not permitted. It's everybody's just going to show up. It's not, there's no, nobody's organizing it. It's just a spontaneous demonstration of our First Amendment rights. Okay, so I don't know who was going to talk about, were there questions about No Kings? Yeah. The question is, will the police allow us to be in the street? And no, we have to follow all ordinances, traffic laws, city laws, all the things. However, that's a lot of people in a very small space, and it could just happen that the police will feel that due to safety, they need to block off streets, and then people will be out in the streets if that happens, or it could happen in the opposite direction. People get in the streets and then, but our goal is that we're all going to follow the rules and stay on, be safe and not go out and play in traffic and all of that. So yeah, usually they at least block off somewhere. And they have tried narrowing center to sort of limit how many cars are coming down center. I don't know if they're going to do that again or not. It's all speculation really at this point. Kendra?
Possibly cut the bus route up and move it over a street.
So Kendra's saying for those of you who use the bus, they'll probably alter the bus routes around the demonstration. Yeah.
So if you want to use the bus, I recommend that you walk over to downtown or jog before the event starts and before it gets too big to alter it.
Okay. Thank you, Kendra.
Yeah.
All right. So are we ready to move on to endorsements? We have the results. Tom, would you like to share the results?
I mean, I kind of already did.
So we had our first poll survey for the election, the primary election. A lot of you probably got the email, but not enough of you responded to it. I can tell you 89 people responded to that poll, to that survey. And it was, if I could show you this graphic, I could plug this in, but it's really not that worth it. But I can kind of just a little bit show you.
Not worth it for me at all.
The results were ridiculously, overwhelmingly, like in the mayor race, Julie got 1 vote. So, and it was like that all the way down from Ward 2, 4, 8, and the county commissioners. I mean, it's just overwhelmingly progressive. It's not even worth talking about. But the poll is closed, and we're going to open up another poll for all of the races at the state level, probably starting Friday or Saturday. Here you go.
Thank you.
Really?
Okay, you know what? Check your spam because, oh, you did. Okay. Okay.
So I will say this about that. All of our emails are coming from info at Salem Region Indivisible.org. So look for that. And I'm sorry that it lands in your junk or somewhere else. That's happened to a whole bunch of people. But if a whole bunch of people have found it there, so when you do, add it to your contacts or something, so you can get it. And we're working on trying to figure out why it's doing that. I don't know.
So I have this up on the screen right here where we're showing the results. Obviously for Mayor Vanessa Nordike, for Ward 2, Linda Nishioka, who's the incumbent, for Ward 4, David Inbody, who's the challenger, and it doesn't show up, but for Ward 6, which is also in play, Mai Vang is the incumbent. And I don't remember Ward 8, but I don't know why it's not showing up. Mickey Varney, who's also the incumbent. Susan. Mickey. M. M-I-C. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Susan.
What is the subject heading in the email that we will look for?
What is the subject heading in the email that we will look for?
SRI primary election.
SRI primary election is the name of the email that you're looking for. So if anybody is burning to add a second vote to Julie Hoy, you can email steering@salemregionindivisible.org and we'll add that for her. All right, so we have round 2 where we are gonna poll you on state government. So you'll have an opportunity to weigh in, right, Tom?
Yeah.
It's on state government? Yeah. And those entries will be due on Friday. Again, I can't do it on this. All right. So, what?
When is that gonna go out?
Friday.
So it will go out Friday or it closes on Friday?
Sorry, Friday or Saturday.
It will go out Friday or Saturday. When does it close?
We'll give it 10 days.
It'll close in 10 days after that. Okay. So Kathleen, who kindly has been sort of at the head of our endorsement, process and whatnot, asked us to share this info. She couldn't be here tonight. She had to go pick somebody up at the airport, but she asked us to share how can we hear all the time people come to our meetings and they're like, I want to do something. I want to get involved. I got to talk to people. Like, you want me to what? Knock on doors and stuff? Like, so I don't know how many here are familiar with the song Alice's Restaurant?
Yes.
And where he asks people to sing along and then he tells them they're horrible and that if they want to end war and stuff, they got to sing loud. You want to end fascism and stuff, you got to talk to people. So get out there and canvass for the candidate that you support. We're not telling you who to support, but get out there and support, because guess what? People who start at the state level go on to be Lori Chavez DeReamer in a cabinet somewhere wreaking havoc, right? So if we stop them here, they won't go on. Okay, so if you would like to help out, you can canvass in your neighborhoods every Saturday at 10 a.m. It's not the Dems who are canvassing, but they've allowed their offices for people to meet. They do it at 10 and 1 p.m., 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. You can contact your county commissioners, donate to campaigns. You can follow campaigns on social media and amplify them, and you can like and repost. Okay, so we have 2 winners for the t-shirts. You can come up and choose your size if you'd like. Bradley Reed and Peter Burgell. Yay, thank you for those t-shirts. And then I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. And sir, I'm happy to talk to you now if you would like to talk.